15 years ago, he rode out of town, leaving behind whispers of betrayal and the stench of blood. The desert sun burned his promises to ash, but now he's back, chasing a peace old cowboys rarely find. The streets greet him with silence sharper than a blade, and a stranger's shadow waits to settle an old score. And then the town whispered, "Will you return a traitor or a hero?" Hey, listener, how's it going? Where are you tuning in from today? The hoofbeats of his horse echoed like a heartbeat against the cracked earth. Jack Tully, weathered by 15 years of wandering, rode into Redstone under a sky too blue for the trouble he felt brewing. His hat, stained with sweat and dust, sat low over eyes that had seen too many bad endings. The town's main street stretched out before him, lined with warped wooden storefronts and folks who stopped dead in their tracks to stare. No one waved, no one offered a nod or a cup of water, just eyes sharp and suspicious, tracking him like wolves circling a wounded elk. Jack's spurs clinked softly as he swung down from his mare, tying her to a post outside the post office. His boots kicked up little clouds of dust, each step heavier than the last. He'd hoped for a quiet return, maybe a bed at the inn and a bottle to dull the ache of old memories. But the air in Redstone felt thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. Faces he half recognized peered from doorways. Old man Carter, who used to run the general store, now hunched and gray. A woman whose name he couldn't place, clutching a basket like it was a shield. They all knew him, or thought they did. The saloon's batwing doors creaked in the distance, and Jack's hand twitched near his holster, an old habit that hadn't died. He wasn't expecting a warm welcome, but this silence was something else. It wasn't just unfriendly, it was loaded, like a rifle with the hammer cocked. He scanned the street for any sign of the men he'd once called friends, or at least allies. Nothing. Just dust and glares and the faint smell of horse sweat. He pushed toward the inn, his saddlebag slung over one shoulder, each step stirring whispers from the shadows. "That's Tully," someone muttered from a porch. "Thought he was dead." Another voice, lower, hissed, "Should have stayed gone." Jack kept his eyes forward, but the words stung worse than the sun. He'd left Redstone a lifetime ago, running from a mistake he couldn't undo. Now, every glance from these folks reminded him, the past doesn't bury easy in a place like this. The inn sign hung crooked, paint peeling like skin after a bad burn. Jack paused at the door, feeling the weight of the town's eyes on his back. He wanted a room, a meal, maybe a chance to slip through unnoticed. But deep down, he knew Redstone wasn't offering peace. Not today, not to him. Something was coming. Something uglier than a bar fight or a quick draw. He pushed the door open anyway because Jack Tully never learned to run from trouble, only toward it. Jack stepped out of the inn, his boots scuffing the warped porch boards. The morning sun baked Redstone's main street, turning the dust into a gritty haze that clung to everything. He squinted at the faded posters nailed to every post and wall, their edges curling like dead leaves. "Pay or pray," they read, with a crude skull drawn in charcoal. The message wasn't subtle, and neither was the threat. Jack's jaw tightened as he realized the town he'd left wasn't just changed, it was owned. He walked toward the general store, passing a blacksmith's shop where the hammer fell silent as he approached. The smith, a burly man with a scarred cheek, stared hard before turning back to his work. Jack kept moving, noting the new faces among the old, hard men with revolvers slung low, lounging on crates like they ran the place. They did. The townsfolk scurried past, heads down, paying their dues in glances and hushed voices. Jack spotted old Carter behind the store counter, counting coins with trembling hands while a lanky thug in a black vest leaned over him, grinning. The saloon across the street buzzed with low murmurs, but no music, no laughter. Jack remembered it differently, rowdy nights, spilled whiskey, and bad poker games. Now it felt like a trap waiting to spring. He overheard a shopkeeper mutter to a woman, "They take half our earnings, and the sheriff's too scared to blink." Jack's fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, not out of intent, but instinct. Redstone's new rulers weren't just bullies, they were a machine, grinding the town to dust. He stopped at a water trough, splashing his face to clear the grit. A kid, no older than 12, watched him from an alley, clutching a broom like it was a rifle. "You Tully?" the boy asked, voice low but steady. Jack nodded, wiping his hands on his coat. "Heard you was a hero once," the kid said, then darted off before Jack could reply. Hero. The word tasted sour. He hadn't come back to play savior, but the town's fear was starting to feel like a rope around his neck. The posters, the armed men, the cowed townsfolk, it all pointed to one truth. Redstone wasn't his anymore. It belonged to whoever held the guns and the nerve. Jack's plan to slip through quietly was unraveling fast. He glanced at the saloon again, knowing answers waited inside, along with trouble. He'd need both if he wanted to survive this homecoming. Jack pushed through the saloon's bat-wing doors, the familiar creak cutting through the heavy air. The room smelled of stale whiskey and sweat, with a dozen pairs of eyes turning to him like vultures spotting a carcass, men hunched over tables, cards forgotten as whispers slithered through the dim light. Jack's boots thudded against the floorboards, each step drawing more stairs. He headed for the bar, where a barkeep with a patchy beard froze mid-wipe, his rag dangling like a surrender flag. "Whiskey," Jack said, voice low but clear, dropping a coin on the counter. The barkeep poured, hands unsteady, and slid the glass over. Without a word, Jack took a sip, feeling the burn, and scanned the room. A grizzled man in the corner, maybe a rancher he once knew, muttered, "That's Tully, the one who ran." Across the room, a woman with tired eyes leaned forward, saying to her companion, "He pulled my boy from a burning barn once." The saloon was a split jury. Half saw a traitor, half a ghost of a hero. Jack's grip tightened on the glass as memories clawed their way up. 15 years ago, he'd stood on the same street, blood on his hands, choosing to ride out instead of face the consequences. Now, every whisper in the saloon was a mirror reflecting the man he'd been. A drunk at a nearby table slurred, "Thought you'd be dead by now, Tully. Why'd you come back?" Jack met his gaze, steady but silent, letting the question hang like smoke. The tension broke when a heavy-set man in a frayed coat stood up, pointing a shaky finger. "You got no right being here after what you did," he spat, voice loud enough to hush the room. "Left us to rot while you saved your own skin." Jack set his glass down, slow and deliberate. "Did what I had to," he said, words clipped but heavy. "Not here to argue history." The man scoffed but sat, cowed by Jack's stare. The saloon's air grew thicker, like the town itself was holding its breath. Jack knew he wasn't just a stranger here. He was a spark in a powder keg. Every step he took stirred old wounds, and the split opinions made him a target. He finished his drink, the burn grounding him, and pushed away from the bar. Trouble was already circling, and he'd just lit the fuse. Jack stepped onto the street, the saloon's noise fading behind him like a bad dream. Dust swirled around his boots as the midday sun hammered Redstone, casting long shadows that seemed to point at him. He adjusted his hat, eyes scanning the storefronts, when a figure emerged from the alley ahead, tall, dressed in black, with a revolver slung low and a stride that owned the ground. Jack froze. It was Caleb, his younger brother, the boy he'd once pulled from a noose. Now he was no boy. Just a man with cold eyes and a dozen armed shadows at his back. Caleb stopped 10 paces away, his black coat flapping in the dry wind. The street cleared fast, townsfolk scattering like roaches under a lantern. Jack's hand hovered near his holster, not drawing, but ready. Caleb's gaze locked on him, sharp as a blade, carrying years of unspoken betrayal. "Didn't think you'd show your face here again," Caleb said, his voice low, each word deliberate. "Thought the desert ate you." Jack shifted his weight, keeping his tone even. "Desert don't want me yet. You seem to be doing fine, though." Caleb's lip twitched, not quite a smile. "Fine. I built something here after you left me to hang." He gestured to the armed men behind him, their hands resting on guns, watching Jack like hawks. "This town's mine now. You got no place in it." Jack's chest tightened, but he kept his face stone. "Didn't come to take it, Caleb. Just passing through." Caleb stepped closer, boots grinding dust. "You don't pass through Redstone. You answer to it." The air between them crackled, heavy with 15 years of silence. Jack remembered Caleb as a kid, all wide eyes and reckless dreams, trailing him like a shadow. Now that shadow led a pack of wolves. "You're the one they're scared of," Jack said, nodding toward the empty street. "That what you wanted?" Caleb's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Jack saw the boy he'd known flicker in them. Then it was gone. "What I wanted," Caleb said, "was a brother who didn't run." Jack's throat burned, but he held his ground. The townsfolk watched from windows, their faces pale blurs. Caleb's men shifted, waiting for a signal. Jack knew one wrong word could spark a fight he wasn't ready for. He met Caleb's stare, seeing not just anger, but pain. The past stood between them like a loaded gun, and neither was ready to pull the trigger yet. Jack stood rooted to the street, Caleb's words still ringing like a church bell at a funeral. The sun baked his neck, but the heat in his chest came from his brother's glare, sharp enough to cut through 15 years of regret. Caleb's men fanned out, their boots scuffing the dirt, hands twitching near revolvers. Townsfolk peered from doorways, their whispers buzzing like flies over a corpse. "He's the one who left Caleb to die," a voice hissed from a shop porch. Another, softer, countered, "Heard he saved half this town once." Jack's jaw clenched. The town's split verdict felt like a noose tightening. Caleb stepped closer, his voice low but heavy. "You walked away when I needed you most, Jack. Left me swinging in the wind for those rustlers to finish." Jack's mind flashed to that day, cutting Caleb free, blood on his hands, knowing he couldn't stay to face the consequences. "I got you out," Jack said, voice steady despite the weight in his gut. "Wasn't enough to stick around and die for it." Caleb's eyes darkened. "You didn't die. You just ran." The accusation landed like a punch. Jack saw it now. Caleb's power, his black coat, his band of thugs, it was all built on that betrayal. The town's whispers grew louder, a mix of scorn and hope. An old woman near the saloon muttered, "He could set things right." A shopkeeper snapped back, "Right? He's why we're in this mess." Jack wanted to shout that he wasn't the cause of Redstone's fall, but the truth gnawed at him. His leaving hadn't helped. Caleb turned to his men, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This man's no hero. He's a ghost who don't belong." He faced Jack again, closer now, almost within arm's reach. "You got one chance to ride out before we settle this for good." Jack's fingers brushed his revolver, not drawing, but grounding himself. "I ain't here to fight you, Caleb," he said, the words tasting like dust. "But I ain't running again, either." The street went quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Caleb's men watched, ready for blood. The townsfolk held their breath, torn between fear and a flicker of hope that Jack might be more than the coward they remembered. Jack felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing down, but for the first time, he didn't look away. He wasn't sure if he was here to save anyone, but he knew he couldn't outrun his brother's pain, or his own. Jack leaned against the inn's porch post, the night air thick with the scent of dust and distant sagebrush. The town was quiet now, but it wasn't peaceful, just holding its breath. He'd spent the day dodging stares and whispers, each one a reminder that Redstone was a powder keg with his name on the fuse. His brother's ultimatum still hung heavy: leave or face the consequences. Jack's fingers traced the worn grip of his revolver, wondering if he'd ever outrun the man he used to be. A shadow moved near the general store, and Jack tensed, hand ready. It was no thug, just old Carter, slipping him a folded note before scurrying back into the dark. Jack unfolded it under the faint glow of a lantern. "We need you," it read, signed by a handful of names, shopkeepers, a widow, even the blacksmith. They wanted him to stay, to challenge Caleb's grip on the town. Jack's stomach twisted. He hadn't come back to play hero, but the note felt like a hook in his gut. Across the street, a different group gathered near the saloon, their voices low but sharp. "Tully's trouble," one said, a wiry man with a limp. "He'll get us all killed." Another, a woman clutching a shawl, hissed, "Caleb's boys will burn this town before they let him win." Jack caught their glances, fearful, accusing, desperate. Redstone was split down the middle, and he was the wedge. Caleb's men patrolled the streets, their laughter cutting through the night, a reminder of who held the real power. Jack slipped the note into his pocket, his mind racing. Stay, and he'd face his brother's guns, maybe worse. Leave, and he'd prove the whispers right. Jack Tully, the coward who always runs. He thought of Caleb's face earlier, the hurt beneath the anger, and wondered if he'd already lost the only family he had left. The stars above offered no answers, just cold light on a town waiting for blood. He walked toward the edge of town, boots crunching on gravel, and stopped by the old church, its steeple leaning like a drunk. In the silence, Jack asked himself what he'd come back for: peace, redemption, or just a place to die. The note in his pocket felt heavier than his gun. Redstone was calling his bluff, and for the first time in years, Jack wasn't sure if he'd fold or fight. Jack crouched behind a stack of barrels, the evening sun painting Redstone Street in shades of fire. He'd been heading to the stables when he saw Caleb's men cornering old Carter outside his store. 3 of them, leering like coyotes, were shaking down the shopkeeper, their hands rough on his collar. Carter's face was pale, his voice pleading as he offered a sack of coins. Jack's first thought was to keep walking. Trouble wasn't his business anymore. Then one thug, a wiry man with a scar across his lip, smirked and said, "Old man, you're short. Guess we'll take the store instead." Jack's blood ran hot. He muttered under his breath, "Vultures used to at least dress better." When the thug raised a fist, something in Jack snapped. He stepped out, boots loud on the dirt, and drawled, "You boys robbing him blind, or just practicing for the stage?" The men spun, hands on their guns, but Jack's revolver was already out, steady as stone. "Let him go," he said, voice low, each word a warning. The scarred thug laughed, but it was nervous. "Tully, you're dumber than you look, crossing us." Jack tilted his head, a half smile hiding the steel in his eyes. "Dumb's my specialty. Now drop the sack." The street went still, townsfolk peeking from windows, their shadows flickering like ghosts. Carter stumbled back, clutching his coins. The second thug, a beefy man with a lazy eye, reached for his gun, but Jack's barrel flicked toward him. "Don't!" Jack said, and the man froze. The third thug spat in the dirt, muttering, "Caleb'll hear about this." Jack nodded. "Tell him I said hello." The men backed off, their bravado crumbling as they retreated down the street, leaving Carter trembling but unharmed. Jack holstered his gun, ignoring the stares from the gathering crowd. Carter grabbed his arm, voice shaky. "You didn't have to do that, Tully. They'll come for you now." Jack shrugged, dusting off his coat. "They were coming anyway." He walked away, feeling the weight of every eye on his back. He'd drawn first blood in this fight, not with bullets, but with defiance. Caleb's men wouldn't let it slide, and the town knew it. Jack's hand rested on his revolver, his mind already bracing for the storm he'd just kicked up. Jack felt the town shift as he walked away from the confrontation, the air buzzing like a hive after a kick. Word of his stand against Caleb's men spread faster than a brush fire, and Redstone streets hummed with it. By dusk, folks who'd avoided his eyes now stole glances, some with hope, others with dread. He headed toward the livery stable, needing to check on his horse, but the weight of what he'd done clung like damp leather. He'd drawn a line in the dirt, and Caleb's crew wouldn't let it stand. Outside the saloon, a small crowd lingered, their voices a low rumble. A woman with a frayed bonnet caught Jack's arm as he passed. "You stirred up a hornet's nest, Tully," she said, her eyes wide but firm. "Those boys don't forgive." Jack tipped his hat, keeping his tone light. "Never was good at making friends." She didn't smile, just shook her head and muttered, "Hope you're as quick as you used to be." Jack moved on, but her words stuck like a burr. At the stable, the blacksmith Tom was pitching hay, his scarred cheek gleaming with sweat. He paused, leaning on his fork. "Heard you spooked Caleb's dogs," he said, voice gruff but not unkind. "Town's talking. Some think you're crazy, others think you're their last shot." Jack checked his mare's hooves, avoiding Tom's gaze. "Don't need their prayers or their bets," he said. "Just needed Carter to keep his store." Tom snorted. "You keep that up, you'll need a coffin." Before Jack could reply, hoofbeats thundered outside. One of Caleb's men, the wiry one from earlier, rode up, his face twisted with spite. "Tully," he barked, reining his horse hard. "Caleb says you got one warning. Back off or you're no brother of his." Jack stepped into the street, hand resting easy near his gun. "Tell Caleb family don't scare me off," he said, voice calm but edged. The rider sneered, then spurred his horse and galloped off, leaving dust and a promise of trouble. The town felt alive now, its pulse quickening. Jack knew he'd painted a target on his back, and Caleb's next move would be bloodier than words. Folks watched from doorways, weighing his odds. He didn't need their cheers. He needed to survive the night. Redstone's law was simple: stand or fall. Jack had chosen, and there was no going back. Jack sat alone in his room at the inn, the oil lamp casting jagged shadows on the cracked walls. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood on the table, its amber glow tempting him to drown the day's weight. Caleb's warning echoed in his head. "Back off, or you're no brother." The words cut deeper than any blade, stirring memories of a kid who once looked up to him. Jack's fingers grazed the bottle, then pulled back. For once, the answer wasn't at the bottom of a glass. He leaned back in the creaking chair, staring at the revolver on his belt. 15 years ago, he'd run from Redstone, leaving Caleb to face the fallout of their last stand. He'd told himself it was survival, not cowardice, but the truth gnawed at him now. The town's split voices, some calling him a hero, others a traitor, weren't just noise. They were a mirror, forcing him to face the man he'd become. He muttered to himself, "Keep running, Jack, and you'll just find more dust." The note from Carter and the others lay crumpled on the table, its plea heavy. Stay, fight, save us. But saving Redstone meant facing Caleb, not just his guns, but the boy Jack had failed. He thought of the kid he'd cut from a noose, all fire and dreams, now twisted into a man who ruled with fear. Jack's hand moved from the bottle to his revolver, fingers tracing the cold steel. Staying meant blood, maybe his, maybe Caleb's. Leaving meant proving the whispers right. A knock at the door snapped him upright. It was the innkeeper, a wiry woman with gray streaks in her hair. "Folks are talking, Tully," she said, voice low. "Some want you to take Caleb down. Others say you'll just bring his wrath on us all." Jack met her eyes steady. "And you? What do you say?" She paused, then said, "I say you're the only one crazy enough to try." She left without another word, her footsteps fading down the hall. Jack stood, the chair scraping the floor. The whiskey stayed untouched. He buckled his gun belt, the weight familiar, grounding. Caleb's face flashed in his mind, angry, hurt, but still his brother. Jack didn't know if he could save Redstone or even himself, but running wasn't an option anymore. He'd face the fight, whatever it cost. The revolver felt heavier than ever, but his hand was steady. Jack walked Redstone's empty streets, the moon casting a pale glow over shuttered windows and locked doors. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Word of his stand against Caleb's men had spread, and now every creak of a board or rustle in the dark made his hand twitch toward his gun. He muttered to himself, "If I die, least let it be sober." New role for an old dog. The humor felt hollow, but it kept his feet moving. Folks had started preparing for trouble. He saw shadows of families hauling crates inside, boarding up windows like a storm was coming. At the edge of town, the blacksmith was sharpening a pitchfork, his scarred face grim. "Heard you're staying," he said as Jack passed. "Hope you know what you're doing." Jack tipped his hat, voice dry. "Never did, Tom. Just good at faking it." The blacksmith shook his head but didn't argue, his hammer ringing out into the night. Jack stopped by the old water tower, its rusted frame looming like a skeleton. He leaned against it, the cool metal grounding him. Tomorrow, Caleb would come for him, maybe with words, maybe with bullets. The thought of facing his brother, not as a kid, but as a man leading a pack of killers, twisted Jack's gut. He'd spent years running from that noose, from the blood on his hands, but Redstone wouldn't let him hide. The town's fear, its hope, its judgment, they all pinned him down. A soft step behind him made Jack turn, hand on his revolver. It was the kid from the alley days ago, clutching that same broom. "They say you're gonna fight Caleb," the boy whispered, eyes wide. "You scared?" Jack crouched to meet his gaze, honest for once. "Scared don't cover it, kid, but sometimes you gotta walk through the fire anyway." The boy nodded like he understood, then slipped back into the shadows. Jack straightened, the weight of his choice settling in. Tomorrow's fight wasn't just about Caleb or the town. It was about proving he wasn't the man who ran. The streets were silent now, but they'd roar soon enough. He checked his gun, each bullet a promise to himself. Redstone was ready to bleed, and Jack was ready to face it, come hell or high water. The first light of dawn broke over Redstone, painting the main street in a blood-red glow. Jack stood at one end, boots planted in the dust, his shadow stretching long behind him. Across the way, Caleb waited, black coat flapping like a vulture's wings, his men fanned out in a loose semicircle. Townsfolk lined the porches, their faces taut with fear and expectation, eyes darting between the brothers. The air was thick, charged with the promise of violence, and Jack's hand rested steady near his revolver. He muttered under his breath, "Guess this is where the story turns." Caleb stepped forward, his voice carrying over the silent street. "You had your chance to leave, Jack. Now you're just a fool standing in my way." Jack's eyes locked on his brother's, seeing the boy he'd saved mixed with the man who'd hardened into a stranger. "Ain't about your way, Caleb," Jack said, voice calm but firm. "It's about what's right. You forgot that somewhere." Caleb's lip curled, but his eyes flickered with something doubt, maybe pain. The townsfolk held their breath, their gazes heavy with years of grudges and hopes. Old Carter clutched his hat, the widow from the saloon whispered a prayer, and the kid with the broom watched wide-eyed from an alley. Jack felt their weight, not as a hero, but as a man who'd run too long. Caleb's men shifted, fingers itching on triggers, but this wasn't their fight. Not yet. The brothers' eyes held a silent conversation, love buried under betrayal, duty tangled with regret. Caleb's hand twitched and the street exploded into motion. Jack drew, his revolver flashing in the dawn light, the crack of gunfire splitting the air. Caleb's shot came a heartbeat later, dust kicking up where ultimatums, where Jack stood. Jack's bullet grazed Caleb's arm, blood staining his sleeve, but Caleb stayed upright, his own gun still raised. "You can't fix this!" Caleb shouted, voice raw. Jack didn't flinch, holstering his weapon as Caleb's men closed in, their guns drawn. The town watched, stunned, as Caleb clutched his arm, his face a mask of rage and hurt. Jack stood his ground, knowing the fight wasn't over, but the first blow was struck. He'd chosen his side, and Redstone would never be the same. The dust settled on Redstone's main street, the echo of gunfire fading into a heavy silence. Caleb stood clutching his wounded arm, blood seeping through his black coat, his men frozen, awaiting his signal. Jack lowered his revolver, his chest tight, but his hand steady. The townsfolk watched, their faces a mix of shock and cautious hope, as if the world had shifted beneath their feet. Jack's voice broke the quiet, low and even. "This ain't what I came back for, Caleb, but it's what you made it." Caleb's eyes burned with fury, but he didn't raise his gun again. Instead, he waved his men back, their boots scuffing reluctantly in the dirt. "You think this changes anything?" He spat, voice thick with pain. "You're still the man who left me." Jack stepped closer, ignoring the rifles aimed his way. "I left to keep you alive," he said, words heavy with years of guilt. "Didn't see another way then. I see it now." The crowd stirred, whispers rippling like wind over dry grass. Old Carter stepped forward, his voice shaky but clear. "Tully stood up when no one else would. That's enough for me." The widow from the saloon nodded, her shawl tight around her shoulders. "He's no traitor," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Slowly, more voices joined, a murmur of support that felt like a tide turning. Caleb's men glanced at each other, their confidence cracking. Caleb staggered, his face pale, but he held Jack's gaze. "You can't undo the past," he said, softer now, almost a plea. Jack nodded, his throat tight. "Maybe not, but I can stop running from it." He turned to the townsfolk, his voice steady. "This town's yours again if you'll fight for it." The kid with the broom stepped out, clutching it like a rifle, and others followed. Men, women, even the blacksmith, his hammer in hand. Caleb's men backed off, outnumbered by the town's resolve. Caleb swayed, then turned, limping away with his crew, their shadows long in the rising sun. Jack watched them go, knowing this wasn't the end but a beginning. He hadn't come for revenge or glory, just to finish what he'd started wrong. Redstone looked at him differently now, not as a hero, but as a man who'd faced his ghosts. Jack tipped his hat to the crowd and walked toward the inn, thinking, maybe I didn't fix it all, but I started right. Jack sat on the inn's porch, the evening sun dipping low, painting Redstone in a soft gold that felt almost kind. His boots rested on a crate, his revolver finally still in its holster. The town was stirring back to life. Shopkeepers swept their stoops. The blacksmith's hammer rang again, and the kid with the broom was now hauling water, grinning like he'd won a prize. Caleb and his men hadn't returned, though Jack knew his brother was out there, licking wounds and maybe rethinking his choices. Redstone wasn't free yet, but it was breathing easier, and that was enough for now. He tipped his hat back, chuckling to himself. 15 years running, and I end up playing hero in the one place I swore I'd never see again. Ain't that a kick in the teeth? The widow from the saloon passed by, tossing him a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "Don't get cocky, Tully," she said, her smile sharp but warm. "You're still a pain in the ass." Jack caught the bread, nodding. "Fair enough. Least I'm a pain with a purpose now." The town had changed, and so had he. Jack wasn't the man who'd run from blood and Ra is one and dust 15 years ago, nor was he a legend. He was just Jack Tully, a man who'd faced his mistakes and found a reason to stay. As he tore off a piece of bread, he thought of Caleb's face, angry, hurt, but human. Maybe one day they'd talk, not fight. For now, Jack was content to sit, eat, and let Redstone figure out its next chapter. Not a bad ending, he muttered, for an old dog like me.